and potential level of risk. For example, know the difference between quantitative and qualitative risk analysis. Here's some more exammy examples. Again, more exammy examples of using your risk analysis methodology. Remember, I told you at least annually, but they also say anytime you have significant change, right? You introduce a new system. They said you want to do an ad hoc risk assessment when you introduce that system, not just on the periodic annual basis, for example. Again, since this is all based on quantitative risk assessment, it's based on numbers, you need some good numbers data to be able to estimate. If you don't have any history, you're left with opinion-based, which is subjective or qualitative risk analysis. Again, the quantification of risk based on probability times of the threat exploiting a vulnerability times the impact of the consequence of an asset. Again, they just call it consequence. I put in parentheses impact because that's the true thing that you're measuring there. Risk is measured in impact. Risk aggregation used to ensure that the combined value of low-level risk is not overlooked in the risk management process, meaning, again, going back to that system failing a process, if it only fails one process and the process is insignificant, there's not much risk there. But what if that one system failure manages to disrupt 1 million otherwise insignificant processes? Put all together, it's significant, is what they're saying. So be careful. You need to be able to aggregate risk of individual risk to determine the value of an overall control. So, factors that affect likelihood. Wow, this is a new question for you. What says that you're going to have an increase of likelihood of an incident occurring, a consequence? Well, if the threat has higher skill and motivation, if it has more knowledge of your vulnerabilities, if it has use of popular hardware or software, value of an asset, environmental factors such as politics, activists, disgruntled employees, these can all affect the likelihood of your incident because of the likelihood of threat and capability of threat. So, risk analysis methodologies, again, probability and impact are used to calculate that risk. They also point out the level of impact, the overall impact, should consider proportionality. So they point out, and this is unique on this exam, a loss of $500,000 using U.S. currency is of greater consequence and impact to a company that doesn't have much money. Maybe they only have $1 million total, so that's half their worth, as opposed to losing $500,000 for a company capitalized at $1 billion. Proportionality is what they call that. Great. So again, I pointed out a risk is really a combination of the consequences that follow from the occurrence of an unwanted event, along with the likelihood of that event. We talked about that. So we've already talked about risk identification, and now we're talking about using that in a risk assessment. Can I ask how many calculation-based questions I would expect to see on the exam? SB, you can back me up on this, but I'm really expecting, when they get to the annual loss expectancy questions, you're probably only going to get one, but they'll still be asking you about how to do it, or whether it's qualitative or quantitative. We'll get to the actual estimation itself later as an example, though. Hang with me on that one. Going on. Again, risk assessments. According to ISACA, again, an enterprise-wide risk assessment conducted on a yearly basis. It's not the first time you've heard it. The risk assessment itself, you have to recognize that a risk assessment means we've determined the value of our information assets. We've looked at applicable threats and vulnerabilities. You're very welcome, MP. Pardon me. Sorry. And determining consequences. Now then, in consequence determination, take a look at that because that's where your new examining questions are. A risk assessment supports identifying and ranking of risk according to what? Business impact. Prioritizing deployment and monitoring of IT risk controls is considered a primary purpose of performing an IT risk assessment. So in other words, why would you even do an IT risk assessment? So you could better prioritize your controls. applying controls that control more impact instead of less. A risk assessment, the output of a risk assessment is an input into decision making. Wow, look at the risk we're going to get ourselves into if we go this direction. Maybe we shouldn't go. That's using risk analysis in your strategic decision making, which is a wonderful thing that often isn't done, which is unfortunate. So in other words, look before you leap, not after. Risk analysis is typically used to manage project risk when making go, no-go decisions at critical stages or phases of a project. That's true. Risk assessment triggers, again, any kind of changes, but also anything that considered to have a life cycle starting from initial concept to definition could be needing risk assessments through the entire life cycle, not just at the start, is what they're saying. So, acquisition, deployment of a new asset should trigger a non-routine or ad hoc risk assessment. Nothing new. We've seen that before as well. Let's take a look at the practice questions. So what type of risk analysis derives probability and impact of risk scenarios from statistical methods and data? What do you think? I think you should have this one. Let's see what we got. You are correct, quantitative. And for the folks that went with statistical, remember we have two